All right. So, we're going to be diving into something that I think can be a bit of a head scratcher for Canadian gun owners.
Okay.
And that is transporting restricted firearms.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure many of us have had that moment where you're packing up for the range and you're like, wait a second, do I need to call the Canadian Firearms program every single time
Right.
that I want to, take this thing out?
It's a super common question. And to be honest, the rules can seem a bit confusing at first glance.
Yeah, they can, for sure.
The good news is it's not as complicated as you might think.
Yeah, that's what we're here to kind of untangle today.
Exactly.
And we've got some great info straight from the RCMP.
Absolutely.
So, we're dealing with the official stuff here.
Straight from the source.
Straight from the source.
Yeah.
And get this.
Yeah.
You might be surprised to learn that you don't actually need to make that call every time you head out.
Yeah.
Thanks to something called an ATT.
That's right, the authorization to transport.
Authorization to transport.
It's automatically linked to your possession and acquisition license when you buy a restricted firearm.
Okay.
So think of it as your built-in permission slip for that routine lawful transport.
Okay, so trips to the range.
Yep.
Those are all covered.
Absolutely.
That's a huge weight off, honestly.
For sure.
But what about those less common situations?
Yeah.
When do I need to get a separate ATT?
Great question.
What if I'm moving?
Moving, that's a perfect example of when you would need a separate ATT.
Okay.
Because you're essentially changing the registered location of the firearm. So you need that specific authorization to transport it to your new address.
Okay, so it's like
Right.
updating your address on your driver's license.
Exactly.
But for your firearm.
For your firearm, exactly. Another scenario is if you're taking your firearm across provincial or territorial borders.
Okay.
Each province has its own set of regulations.
Right.
So you need a separate ATT for those trips.
Mm-hmm.
And while we're on the topic of kind of specific situations, participating in a shooting competition or event that isn't covered by your existing ATT
Right.
would also require you to apply for a separate authorization.
So it's really about anything inside of those everyday
Yes.
routine activities that are already covered by your
initial ATT.
initial ATT. Okay,
Yeah.
got it.
Yeah.
But what about shipping?
Okay.
Let's say I need to send my restricted firearm to a gunsmith in another province.
Yep.
Do I need an ATT for that?
So actually, when you're using a licensed carrier,
Right.
an ATT isn't required.
Okay,
The regulations are a bit different in those cases.
gotcha.
What's crucial here is making sure that you are using a carrier that's authorized to handle firearms.
So it's not just about
Right.
choosing any random shipping company.
Exactly.
Right.
There are specific
You
criteria.
pay me.
Absolutely. The RCMP is really strict about secure shipping methods to prevent any issues during transport. Think about it. You want to make absolutely sure that firearm is transported safely and responsibly with no risk of loss, theft, or accidents.
For sure. It makes total sense. But how do I even know which carriers are legit for transporting firearms?
Yeah.
Is there a list somewhere?
You can actually find a list of licensed carriers on the RCMP's website. They have a whole section dedicated to firearms with tons of helpful information.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
So we've got moving, crossing provincial borders, specific events.
Mm-hmm.
Now, shipping. Is there anything else that would trigger the need for a separate ATT?
Well, there are a few more niche situations, but those are the big ones.
Okay.
Remember, if you are ever unsure, you can always reach out to the Canadian Firearms program directly.
Oh.
They're a fantastic resource and can walk you through any specific scenarios that you might have.
Perfect. So we know when we need a separate ATT.
Right.
But how do we actually go about getting one?
Okay.
What's the process like?
So it's actually pretty straightforward. There's a specific form you need to fill out.
Okay.
It's the RCMP 5490,
Okay.
which you can find online. You can either apply online through the RCMP's individual web services portal, or if you prefer the good old-fashioned way, you can mail the completed form to the Canadian Firearms Program office in your province.
So a couple of different options to choose from, which is nice.
Exactly.
And what about non-residents?
Right.
They've got their own set of rules, right?
Definitely non-residents temporarily bringing restricted firearms into Canada need to contact the chief firearms officer at their point of entry to apply for an ATT.
Okay.
Planning ahead is key here, so it's best to reach out well before their trip
Right.
to make sure everything is in order.
It sounds like there's a process for everyone.
There is.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already, from routine transport with your existing ATT
Yep.
to specific situations requiring a separate ATT.
We have, and we've touched on some key resources like the RCMP website and the Canadian Firearms Program. But there's even more to explore.
Stay tuned, folks, because when we come back, we're going to dive deeper into those secure shipping methods and talk about how you can stay up to date with any changes to the regulations.
Welcome back to our deep dive on transporting restricted firearms in Canada. Um, Before we move on, I think it's important to emphasize that even though you don't need a separate ATT when shipping with a licensed carrier, the whole process is really built around safety and responsibility.
Right, we touched on secure shipping methods a little bit earlier,
Yeah.
but let's unpack that a bit more. What are some of the specific things that the RCMP wants us to be aware of?
Well, the first and most obvious one is that the firearm has to be unloaded.
Okay.
That's non-negotiable, and it just makes sense.
Right.
But it goes beyond that. The RCMP also stresses proper packaging.
Okay.
We're not talking about just towing it in any old box.
So what kind of packaging are we talking about?
Right.
Like specialized cases?
Ideally, yes. You want a case specifically designed for firearms, something sturdy that can protect it from damage, moisture, you name it. And of course, unauthorized access is a big concern, so the case needs to be secure.
Right. Okay, so we've got the firearm unloaded, secured in a proper case.
Uh-huh.
What about labeling?
Right.
I imagine you don't want to advertise what's inside the package.
Exactly. It's a balancing act. You don't want anything flashy that screams firearm, but it needs to be clearly labeled for the carrier and anyone handling it along the way.
So discreet, but clear labeling
Exactly.
is key. Got it.
Yep.
What about paperwork? Anything specific required for shipping?
Absolutely. You'll need to include all the relevant documentation. Things like your payout information, the recipient's info, and any permits or licenses that apply.
Okay.
It's all about transparency and making sure everything is above board.
Right, so it's not just about the physical security of the firearm itself.
Yeah, exactly.
It's also about, like, having all your ducks in a row when it comes to
the paperwork.
paperwork. Exactly.
Precisely. It demonstrates that, that shipment is legitimate and authorized. But keep in mind, even though the general rules are pretty clear, the specifics can sometimes vary depending on the carrier you choose.
So it's always a good idea to double check with the specific carrier
Exactly.
that you're using.
Yeah, just to be on the safe side.
Just to be on the safe side.
For sure.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that's super important for any gun owner staying up to date with the regulations.
Yes.
We know these things can change over time, and with something as sensitive as firearms, it's crucial to be in the know.
Couldn't agree more. Luckily, there are some great resources out there to help us stay informed. The RCMP website is always a good starting point.
Okay.
They have a whole section dedicated to firearms, including detailed information on transport regulations.
So straight from the source.
Straight from the source.
But let's say I want to go beyond the basics.
Okay.
And really delve into the nuances of these regulations.
Right.
Are there any other resources you'd recommend?
Absolutely. There are organizations like the BC Fires Academy that go above and beyond in providing expert guidance on firearms regulations and training.
I've heard good things about them. What kind of stuff do they offer?
They offer courses, resources, expert advice, you name it. It's a fantastic way to deepen your understanding of responsible gun ownership and make sure you're completely on top of the current regulations.
So we've got the RCMP website, organizations like the BC Firearms Academy.
Yep.
And of course, if you're ever in doubt,
Right?
you can always reach out to the Canadian Firearms Program directly.
Exactly. They're there to help. It's great to see how many resources are available to help Canadian gun owners navigate these regulations responsibly.
It really is. Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground today.
Yeah.
From the role of the ATT to the importance of secure shipping,
Uh-huh.
and even how to stay up to date on the ever-evolving world of firearm regulations.
We have, and it's been a great reminder that knowledge is power,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to responsible gun ownership.
Before we wrap up this deep dive, we've got one last segment coming up. We'll leave you with some final thoughts, maybe even a little challenge to consider as you continue your journey as a responsible gun owner in Canada. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive, into Canadian restricted firearm transport rules. We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we?
Yeah, it has been a journey.
From the ins and outs of the ATT to the nitty-gritty of shipping with a licensed carrier, and even how to stay on top of any changes in the regulations.
Absolutely. It's been a great reminder that knowledge is power, especially when it comes to responsible gun ownership.
Thinking back to when I first got my PAL, I remember feeling a bit overwhelmed by all the rules and regulations. But going through this deep dive with you, it's actually a lot clearer than I initially thought.
Yeah, I think that's a common experience. There's a lot of information out there, and it can be easy to get lost in the details. But when you break it down, it really is all about common sense and responsibility.
For sure. Now that we have a better understanding of the rules, I'm curious, how do you think this knowledge might change our approach to transporting firearms?
Well, for me, it definitely eases my mind knowing that I don't need to call the Canadian Firearms Program every time I'm heading out to the range with my restricted firearm. As long as I'm staying within those routine, lawful activities covered by my ATT, I'm good to go.
Yeah, that's a great point. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of the equation. And speaking of taking the guesswork out, I know I'll definitely be bookmarking that RCMP website and checking out those resources from the BC Firearms Academy.
Absolutely.
Knowledge is power, right?
Knowledge is power, and remember, this deep dive is just a starting point. There's always more to learn, and staying informed is an ongoing process. So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep striving to be the most responsible gun owner you can be. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Canadian restricted firearm transport rules. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. It has been great chatting with you. Thanks for joining us, everyone.